Welcome to this episode of Reaching and Equipping, a podcast whose aim is to empower every member of Christ Church to walk faithfully with Him and answer His call to go and make disciples. Today we're here with Andrew, or Coach K, as some know him, the campus pastor at Northridge Fall City. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. This episode, we're going to be talking through a passage of Scripture, Isaiah 6. You're preaching this week?
That's correct.
I'm preaching this week, and we're preaching Isaiah 6. We were planning on getting together anyway, just to talk through the text, talk through questions, ideas, and I thought it'd be interesting, could be fun for people to listen in on the conversation. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, it's a good text.
Are you nervous at all to preach Isaiah 6?
Maybe nervous in maybe not a good way, in the sense of this is such a amazing passage. It's glorious. This one's been personally, one of my favorite passages of Scripture. Nothing has quite, I think, shaped my theology and thinking of God like Isaiah chapter 6. Listen to R.C. Sproul talk about the holiness of God, lit a fire where I realized, man, God is holy. And so the nervousness is man, I want to bring that out in a way that's helpful and encourages people. And my nervousness is I just don't want to mess that up. So
yeah, I feel you. I had to talk through just a heightened level of anxiety. There's always a little bit with preaching, in that it's God's word. Mm-hmm. This is weighty. Every passage is deep and profound and beautiful and glorious. And me, little man, poor and needy man, who is sufficient for these things? Mm-hmm. No one. Ultimately, we get our sufficiency from God. And I think every time I preach, I kind of have a process of being anxious, having to rely, go to God in prayer, ask for help, remember the truths that it's not me who's doing the work, it's the Holy Spirit. So there's a process of that, but I think it's especially heightened for me personally with Isaiah 6. It's so deep. It's so beautiful. It's so good. It's so glorious. And it's a high task to be the one that's delivering that to God's people.
Yeah.
So my structure of prep for preaching is reading the text over multiple times. Then before going to any commentaries or listening to any teachings on the passage, I'll go through the text myself, gathering my initial thoughts, where I try to nail down what my initial interpretations are, what questions I have that I need to discover in my own study or talk through with someone. And then I consult the commentaries, I get outside perspectives, and lastly, I develop an outline for how to structure and deliver the sermon. Somewhere within this process, I really value being able to sit down with someone and dig in and talk through the text, to bounce ideas off them, to hear their perspective, to ask any questions I might have. And that's what we're going to be doing today. I think it's really valuable to have that time where you're just talking through the text. We were talking through before this that you're an external processor, and we kind of shared that in common, that we're both, we have to either write something out to really think through it, or we have to talk to somebody about it. And it's part of both of our processes to write out things. But I really enjoy having someone to talk through the text with.
Yeah, and we did this with, was it Proverbs 1?
Yeah, Proverbs 1.
The second half of that, that was maybe 2 hours long or whatever. And,
yeah.
That was just greatly beneficial. That was really helpful for me, sharpening my thinking. And I just look back at that man, that was a good 2 hours spent.
So I was thinking that we could read through the passage really quick, then just go back and work our way through it, throw out some ideas, ask some questions, and just see what we can get figured out.
Sure. Let's do it.
All right. So Isaiah 6, verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. Then I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste, and the Lord removes people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump.
Glorious.
Glorious. It's amazing. So now it's just up for grabs.
That's right.
Go back to the beginning and see what we can talk about.
I was gonna ask you any high level, like main idea stuff that you're seeing?
Ooh, main idea stuff. Do you have anything?
Just thinking. I think like obviously the holy is kind of the heart, at least of the first 7 verses or so. So yeah, like I think like at this point in my mind, I'm like, man, I think the main point is like God is holy, and then thinking through, okay, what are the implications for that?
Yeah, I think as I have just looked at it and kind of meditated on it, wrote out some thoughts on it, I've just been really impacted by the call of Isaiah, or like this whole sequence that Isaiah has a vision of God and immediately recognizes his sin, and then God extends utter grace to him. Mm-hmm. He cleanses Isaiah of his sin. Isaiah didn't ask to be cleansed. He didn't do anything to be cleansed. God just cleansed him. And then God's like, okay, who's going to go for us? Like, who's going to send this message out or proclaim this message? And Isaiah's like voluntarily says, I'll do it. Mm-hmm. So he responds, and then God commissions him. So it's like this whole sequence of recognizing his sinfulness and humility, God extending grace and cleansing him, and then immediate voluntary service to God, being commissioned.
Yeah, there's a commission. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of just stuck out to me, that pattern of his experience.
Yeah.
Has stuck out to me as like the main idea, this big idea. Mm-hmm. And it's all in reference to God's holiness, like you said. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it seems like I was kind of trying to think through like how much of this maybe solves some of the problems that are introduced in chapters 1 through 5, right? People living in rejection, living in rebellion. They're not holy. In fact, chapter 5 last week talked about how they've rejected the Holy One. They've rejected his law. And God's going to bring judgment to display his holiness, to show, hey, I'm holy and you're not.
Yeah.
And kind of like what you said, like there's a solution to that problem. All right, they're Israel right now. Judah is not holy. And the question is, okay, how do we make this right? Right? Judgment's coming. How do we get this holiness? And it's clear here that, man, it's got to come from God. Mm-hmm. God's the one that's got to provide a way for this to be brought about in the hearts of his people.
What do you think the connection is to the first 5 chapters?
Yeah, I haven't looked at. I know different commentaries say different things about like the structure of Isaiah. Like, should these 5 chapters at the beginning be somewhere else and whatnot? To me, it seems like a pretty natural, just laying out the issues that Isaiah is going to be unpacking throughout the rest of the book, setting the stage, and chapter 5 especially setting the giving his justification for the exile. This is why Babylon eventually is going to come in, is because you've broken the covenant and there's covenant consequences for that. Yeah. And so it seems like that maybe introduces the whole thing. And then this one, chapter 6 really kind of begins with Isaiah's commission, which I think Ezekiel begins right away with his commission. I can't remember if Amos begins with his commission, but it seems like the prophets, like when they start, they get commissioned right away, and then they go into their ministry.
Right.
But Isaiah's a little unique in that it has some of his ministry on the front end, and then it talks about his commission. And I don't know exactly why it's structured that way yet.
It seems like some of the thoughts on it are chapter 6 actually happened first in Isaiah's life. Mm-hmm. And when Isaiah collected these writings, he put chapters 1 through 5 before his commissioning to kind of set the stage or provide a backdrop for what the state of the nation was at the time of his being called out, which I'm just not sure yet. I haven't gone through the commentaries yet either, so hopefully we figure that part out. But I think that's one of the values of going through it with someone else. Like you kind of figure out some of those questions that you have that you need to answer, hopefully through your study. So do you think that there's any significance to the year that King Uzziah died?
Yeah, I, at this point, just think it's kind of a timestamp, like a little, at least partially a timestamp, right? Kind of saying, hey, this is the backdrop. I know, chapter, I think it was 3, chapters 2 and 3 especially, talk about their temptation to put their hope in a man, and the dangers of doing that. And it seems to me maybe there's a little bit of this okay, the king has just died. What do we do now? And this is, and maybe Isaiah's feeling that. Again, that's more speculation, but could potentially have implications of hey, this king's died. What do we do now? Well, God's gonna hey, I'm gonna send my messenger out to proclaim this message that we read about in the second half of it.
Mm-hmm. I think I have done a touch of commentary study. I haven't gotten into the details of each verse yet, but I've kind of looked at some overview commentary stuff, and it seemed like their thought was Uzziah's death marked an end of God's patience. So during the life of Uzziah, the nation was prosperous. We read a lot about how they were getting more wealthy, and along with prosperity and wealth was coming pride and feeling secure in themselves, trusting in man. And once Uzziah dies, it marks the end of this season of prosperity and pride. And now God is going to bring judgment for their lack of repentance during that time. And it is a timestamp in that sense.
I think that's I haven't read any of the commentary stuff yet, but I looked at 2 Kings 15 and then 2 Chronicles 26. That's where the Kings and Chronicles record Uzziah's reign. And Chronicles especially, it talks about at the end he became prideful, and basically said, "You know what? I'm going to become a priest now. I've got all this wealth. I'm successful. I can now offer sacrifices to God." And I think the text even says there's this multitude of priests trying to hold him back, saying don't do this. Don't do this. And
I mean, that's the climax, the culmination of pride.
Yeah, exactly.
Feeling that you're holy enough to go into a place where you are not allowed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm still trying to think through, in preaching, how much background stuff do you bring in? I don't want to preach a 2 Kings sermon or a 2 Chronicles sermon and an Isaiah 6 sermon. And so, I'm still trying to figure out how much maybe that background is either relevant or helpful to bring up.
Mm-hmm. What else?
I was thinking through in not chapter 2, verse 2, right? It talks about the 6 wings they have. I was trying to understand, do you think that's the seraphim covering their own faces, their own eyes, or are they covering the eyes, the face of the Lord as Isaiah is seeing this vision?
Yeah, I had the same question. It seems to me that they're covering their own face, their own feet, and then flying with him. And I was wondering, what's the significance of that? Is maybe the covering of the feet, it seems, is an act of humility. Mm-hmm. It's similar to Moses taking off his shoes. There's something with humility and feet. I don't know what the dynamic is there. I don't know. What do you think? Did you have a different thought of why they were doing that or what was going on there?
Yeah, I was basically at this point, I was just trying to figure out, if they're covering God's face, God's feet. I was okay, they concealing him so that Isaiah can stand before him now. Because Exodus, I think it's I think I wrote it down, 30 something talks about like God's like, hey, no one can see my face
Right.
lest they die.
Yeah.
So one question I have is like, okay, in verse 5, he talks about my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts, trying to figure out to what extent did he see God? Is that like a general term? Like I've been in the presence of God? Did I actually see him face to face? If so, how is he alive before the atonement part of it? That kind of thing.
Yeah. I was wondering so there's that part about the smoke filling the temple.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if maybe that was something like the cloud that covers the presence of God in Exodus, that we see, like the temple when God's presence fills the temple in like First Chronicles, Second Chronicles,
Yes.
in the Chronicles, in the Old Testament, we'll say when God fills the temple, the cloud enters and covers the temple and is like filling it. And it seems like the purpose of the cloud is that like God is not the cloud. It seems like God's presence is within the cloud, and the cloud acts as like a barrier between God and everything else, more so as a protection against everyone else. Do you think that the smoke is working in that way at all?
I was thinking maybe along the lines of Exodus as well, understanding maybe more of the cloud just symbolizing God's presence with his people.
Okay.
I guess I haven't really thought through if it's protecting them from something, more so just associated with his presence, general being, dwelling. I think we even saw that in chapter 4, where I talk about like in that day, Lord, let's see, where is it? Then the Lord will create over the whole, this is in chapter 4, verse 5. The Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and a smoke. That Exodus language there.
And smoke and the shining of the flame of fire by
which
night.
I took to understand that symbolizes God's presence with his people. And so to me, when I saw that the house was filled with smoke, my thought was that it's making a connection with God's presence is all over this temple. And like there's no part of the temple that God is not in.
Right. No, I think that's it. Yeah.
This is all spitballing type stuff. So I want to think about that some more. And
that's good.
Because that's like I was trying to figure. That seems to connect with the idea of like his robe filling the temple, like his rule, his reign goes over the temple, and his presence is over the temple.
Yeah. So okay, what do you think the significance of the train of his robe is?
Yeah,
this one's always kind of confused me. Like, is the longer the robe, the better, the more honorable the person, or what do you think's going on there?
Yeah, I had that exact same. It's honestly funny that I feel like every time I read this section, I always think, I should probably think about that some more, but I just never do. Yeah.
Well, you got to this time.
Because you get down to holy, 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 and you're like, oh, sweet, that's right.
Yeah.
But yeah, my guess is that there's probably some cultural image of like that symbolizes his rule in some way. That's maybe one of the things trying to figure out is like how much of this is symbolic, how much of it is super literal.
Right.
To me, it seems to lend more towards symbolic, and then trying to.
I was wondering if it was along the same lines as you thought the smoke was. Maybe represents his presence as filling the entirety of the temple.
Yeah,
like he's not like he's everywhere. He's throughout. Maybe in the way that they use that language, that the train of his robe filled the temple. Maybe that's what it's trying to communicate.
And like I said, I was trying to figure out if that one's specifically about his rule. Because it talks about he sees the Lord sitting on the throne, he's high and lifted up, and then the train of his robe covers the temple. So that seems to like communicate this idea, man, God is sovereignly ruling and reigning in this place, and there's no space that's not under his rule. And then you get down into verse 4, and the house with smoke and stuff is not just that he rules over it, it's that he's also present in all of it, if that makes sense. Maybe a subtle nuance in that.
Maybe.
But again.
No, that's good. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, anyway.
We'll figure it out.
We'll think through it.
Hopefully. That's good, though. I think that kind of fits into the idea. I think it's in, I can't remember if it was in Isaiah, or maybe it was in another minor prophet that we were studying recently, that everything, not just the temple, will be holy in the New Jerusalem, but like the whole land, like all the vessels. I think this was in Zechariah. So it's kind of off topic, but like all the vessels in all of Jerusalem are going to be holy. And there's like this idea that not just the Holy of Holies is the place of God's presence, but he's like just covering everything.
Yeah.
Everything is now holy because he is there, and he's kind of like pervading all of the city, all of the land.
Yeah. I like that. One thought I was trying to, if I can.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. In verse 5, he says, woe is me, I'm lost, man of unclean lips. I was trying to figure out maybe the significance of his comment that, like, he says, I dwell in the midst of a sinful people of unclean lips.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out like why, like, he recognizes his own sin first,
Right.
which is great. I think there's great application there, man. When he encounters the holy God of the universe, he realizes right away, I should not be here. I'm in big trouble, and I'm a sinner. But then I think it's interesting that he's like, and I also live with all these sinful people.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out, like, why do you think maybe he brings that in?
I'm wondering if it's something where so I have two thoughts on it. One is he's not seeing himself as better than his people. Mm-hmm. Like, he's not seeing himself as someone who's better than or holier than his people. Like, he's recognizing the true state of things. Like, being in the presence of the holiness of God makes him aware that him and all people are dreadfully sinful in comparison to God. And then two, I wonder if it's just more of like, I'm sinful and my people are sinful. Like, I'm hopeless being in the presence of God, and my people are hopeless. So maybe like this despair feeling like this is not good. Mm-hmm. Like, if God is going to smite me in my sinfulness, like, he's going to smite all of us. Like, we're all without hope. And I think it maybe shows his affection for his people, like affection for the people of Israel.
Isaiah's affection?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That he's like not only worried about himself, but he's worried about the people.
Almost like,
well.
I'm not worthy for this. Everyone else around me is also not worthy for this. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that might be it.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on
the
that?
The only other thought I was thinking through is I was trying to figure out, he uses the language of being unclean. And, there's different ways that you could become unclean. Some of those were not directly your fault. So, touch a dead body, maybe you didn't mean to or you didn't know. Right. Now you're unclean. And so I was trying to figure out if he's like associating, like, hey, I've been associated with unclean, like, I'm unclean.
Oh, okay.
I've also been associated with unclean. And so it's like this double whammy of like, I double should not be here.
Oh, yeah.
Not only am I personally unclean, I've been around uncleanness, and uncleanness can't be in the presence of a holy God. And so now I'm in trouble.
The problem is
like exacerbated a little bit.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's right or wrong, but
yeah. What do you think? What's going on with woe is me? What exactly is behind? Like, what are the emotions behind that? What do you think he means when he says woe is me?
Yeah, I talked about woe a little bit this past week in my sermon.
Which, I need to listen to. I wasn't at church on Sunday, so I didn't get to hear Daniel talk through all the woes. But okay, what is woe? Tell me.
Woe? It means woe.
Teach me.
I read Shakespeare in high school. We had to for reading, okay. And we read Hamlet. I actually enjoyed Hamlet. It was good. But there's a famous line, woe is me, and it's kind of communicating this just like sadness for a present circumstance. And I think that's typically how we'd probably understand it in our cultural moment. Woe is me is kind of like this, man, things aren't going my way right now, or I'm sad or in despair about something. So I think that's I think that's true in a sense. But I think woe also communicates a sense of like impending judgment. So you think about like Jesus and the Pharisees. This is how I explain it, at least. He's pronouncing woes like crazy. And I don't think he's saying those because, like those are just, like the Pharisees are sad or people in despair. I think he's saying that because they're about to be judged. They will be judged for their sin.
Their condition is hopeless.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's deeper than just like a sadness about something.
Exactly.
It's more like, this is bad.
Right.
And
judgment.
Like the future is dismal.
Mm-hmm. And that seems to be how Isaiah is using it in 5, right? Those who are, adding houses to themselves, those who are, what else to say? Getting drunk and partying and all that stuff.
Yeah.
All those other woes are against people who are doing things that are not God honoring. And it seems to be not like, oh, that's a sad way to live. It seems more like that way of living will be judged if it left unrepentant.
Yeah. So like seeing the future as judgment dark, dismal,
Yeah.
hopeless. You think that's
Yeah.
he's essentially like he's saying woe is me, and he's recognizing like I'll be dead soon.
Yeah.
Like I'll probably be dead soon because of this circumstance I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, it seems like he's basically almost like calling God's judgment on himself, like recognizing, again, like based on what he says right after, like, I should not be where I am right now. I have, my sin
Yeah.
should not be. I think R.C. Sproul is the one that kind of teaches that. But yeah, that seems to me, that seems to be his woe is me, is he realizes, again, God in his holiness, he's a sinner, and realizes, man, I should be judged right now. Like, that's what my sin deserves. Apart from atonement, which we see, a little bit later on.
Yeah, the thought or the emotion that comes to my mind is when I feel like I've done something wrong. And this happens, like, say I'm at work, and making a mistake at my work is like a huge deal. And there'll be times where like I'll think I've made a mistake, and I haven't actually made a mistake. I'm just like thinking about it wrong, but I'll think I've made a mistake, and there's like my stomach drops, and I like all of a sudden have this this emotion that comes out that's like, oh no, like this is bad. Like the future is dismal. Thinking about
Like there's consequences.
there's
now.
consequences coming.
Yeah, that's
and that
great.
reminds me of that's what comes to mind when I think of woe is me. Like there's consequences coming.
Yeah,
to me.
That's a great personal illustration. You should totally use that.
Yeah, that's good.
I might even say, hey, Ty told me this
Yeah.
week.
I mean, I was talking to you. I was trying to think like, are there any circumstances like that for like a normal person?
Like when they wrecking, to me,
Or maybe like a cop. Like
Yeah.
you're driving, you don't even know if you're speeding or not, but you see a cop and your stomach drops, and you're like, you look down really quick to see if you were speeding, and if you weren't, you're like, oh, it's all good. But if you were, you're like, oh no, and you're like looking in your rear view mirror, and you're like, is he gonna turn? Is he gonna turn? Maybe that's something.
Yeah, and because I think that second one really, I think maybe seems to capture the idea of like you're aware that something is about to happen. So it's not like you're aloof to what's it, like you're like kind of dancing along, not really paying attention to what's going to happen. It's like there's an awareness of something's happened now, and I'm in trouble.
Yeah,
Like I'm
in trouble.
Yeah, like I haven't personally experienced this, but I would imagine that that'd be kind of like if you're running like fraud at a mass level, and the cops or the FBI show up at your house and they say you have a right to remain silent. And I would imagine like that moment is when you're like, oh no,
woe is me.
Woe is me. Yeah,
I would rather be dead right now.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So what about the unclean lips? So the thought that came to my mind, and I'd never really considered this or thought about the fact that he describes his sinfulness as unclean lips. And then I was like, okay, maybe it's connected to the teaching of Jesus that it's not what defiles a person, like what goes in does not defile a person, it's what comes out. And so the lips and the words and the mouth are representative of what's inside. So it's what's internal that comes out of the mouth that actually defiles a person. What do you think about that?
I like that. I think, and that connects like with James 3, right? Our tongues, that need to tame our tongues. It's easy to set a small forest ablaze with it. It seems, and that seems to be, less about like specifically the exact words we say, but like the intention behind those words.
Right.
Like, I mean, I feel like I've had times where I'll say something and I realize it got me in trouble and say, well, I didn't mean that. And in that moment, it's not like, as I look back, it's not that I didn't mean it. It's just that now that I have a consequence, I don't like it anymore. Right. But like that original saying was really where my heart was at in that moment.
Yeah. It's interesting how we do that.
Yeah.
Like we'll say things and then we'll say things like, that wasn't me.
Yeah, exactly.
Or like, I didn't mean it. I was just tired. And you're like, Jesus says, from the heart, the mouth speaks.
Right.
Like out of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Yeah.
Do you think that's pretty solid?
I would say
it sounds really good to me.
Yeah.
But sometimes like those ideas, you just get excited about it.
Yeah. To be honest, personally, I haven't thought much about specifically the unclean lips.
Okay.
I actually end up spending more time thinking about the unclean people and stuff. So I'd love to think about that more, but I like that.
Yeah. And to follow that vein, I'll continue on it. He then is purified through the coal touching his mouth.
Right.
Which I think my thought is it's emblematic of an internal cleansing. Like it symbolizes not just like a purification of his lips, but a full and utter internal and comprehensive purification. And it's interesting that his mouth is the thing that's touched.
Associated with that, yeah.
So it seems to me that would be the image. And then an added interest is the fact that the ministry that Isaiah is called to is speaking. So he says, I'm a man of unclean lips, and then the coal touches his mouth and he's purified. And then his ministry is actually to use his mouth to preach this message from God.
Yeah.
I don't know if that is all working together in that way, but I thought it was super interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't made any of those connections, but I like that, you know, he's not fit apart from God's work in his life for ministry or to do this prophetic ministry. It's not until like he encounters God and realizes his sinfulness, God then deals with it. And, you know, specifically he touches his lips, his guilt, his sins atoned for. And then now all of a sudden, now he's commissioned, right? He's not just like, God doesn't just say like, oh, you're really gifted and so I'll use you. He's like, no, I'm gonna make you new and then send you out.
Yeah.
I like what you're thinking there. That's helpful for me.
Okay.
And
What do you think he means lost?
Yeah,
like, I'm lost.
Yeah.
Do you think it's like location? He doesn't know where he's at?
I think again, I haven't studied. I need to look at the Hebrew of it, but I think this is the phrase that sometimes gets translated like "I'm undone," or like "I'm unraveled." I think that's how R.C. Sproul in one of his sermons on Isaiah 6 talks about it. Like he because of his sin, like he's just like unraveling before God, realizing again like it's just his sinfulness has no. Yeah. So I'm curious to know why the ESV translated that lost, or if that's even a totally different thought. So I don't have thoughts on it.
Okay.
Necessarily
That's fine.
yet.
That's fine. We haven't talked about holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
That's where it's at. My understanding, I'll have to do some more, thinking on this too, is like the threefold repetition is like each like escalating. It's like I've been told, at least I think the way R.C. Sproul teaches it is that it's like raised to the superlative degree. So it's like holy, holier, and then holiest.
Okay.
I think, and so what I'm trying to figure out with that is is it right to say that holiness is like the core of who God is? Like all of his being is holy, and then all of his attributes then are his love is a holy love, his justice is a holy justice, his mercy is a holy mercy, grace is a holy grace. Because one argument he makes is that there's never an attribute of God that's raised like this. And I think the only like the holy shows up again, I think in Revelation somewhere.
Okay.
I have to remember exactly where.
Oh yeah.
But it's like the only threefold repetition of something about his nature or his being.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which is don't want to say like that confirms it or anything.
I always took it as holiness as like an otherness, a set apartness, and the repetition is meaning to just utterly and completely clarify or distinguish or designate God as the most holy. Like if there is any one that is completely other than the creation, it's God. Like he is the most fully unique in all of existence.
Yeah.
In chapter 5, I thought a helpful verse was 16. But the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. So it seems like the righteousness is an outworking of his holiness. So like the fact that he is holy, like he is perfect, he is other than, and is worked itself out in his righteousness. So his righteousness even is like a holy righteousness, where it's a special righteousness. It's a unique righteousness, maybe?
Yeah. I definitely, it seems like righteousness is here it makes it clear he shows himself to be holy because he's going to do something that is righteous. it's like his part of being holy is doing what is right or doing what is righteous.
Yeah. That's
I think Sinclair Ferguson brought this up in a book. And I'd just be curious to hear like what your thoughts are. Like, what does like the holiness of God look like before creation? So like if this is true of God or has been true of God, like, like we talk about God being set apart, like in what sense is he set apart before there's creation and sin? I don't have a total answer for that, but I was
I mean, before creation, God existed in himself.
Yeah.
Like he is.
Right.
And so at that time there was no one to be other than, or nothing to be other than, like nothing to be unique from.
Sure.
And so, I mean, the moment creation enters into existence, God, maybe that's the manifestation. Like God was always holy, but it becomes apparent when there is something else. Like when creation is brought into existence, then all of a sudden something else is aware of God's uniqueness.
Yeah. And by that thing's existence, it draws out what was already there.
Right.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. In the same way, like there's the idea that the way that the universe was created, the way that history is played out, it's making us see more of the unique qualities of God. So we wouldn't have known God's grace if we had never sinned and had to receive that grace, receive that mercy. So like looking at Christ on the cross, we're seeing so many attributes of God, his justice, his mercy, his grace, his love, and we wouldn't have been able to see that if that hadn't happened in that way. And so maybe that's a function of creation, is displaying the holiness of God, is putting it on display for us.
Kind of like the idea that like when God creates, man and woman and everything, it becomes even more apparent how unique he is amongst that. Like he's always been set apart in the sense that he's in his own class. There's no one else. He's unrivaled. Nobody is like God. Nothing in existence is like God. And when creation comes into the picture, it almost like doubles down on that.
Right.
Is that kind of what?
Yeah. That runs along the same line of what I was thinking.
Yeah. Just something I came up with this recently, or came across this recently in thinking about what degree is like wrath an attribute of God, like before sin, like is God wrath? It's like,
I mean, without sin, we wouldn't know his wrath.
Right. To me, like at this point, like I feel like wrath is really just an expression of his justice. Like God has always been just, and once sin comes into picture, he has wrath and anger now because something is not holy, something is wrong.
Right.
And so that wrath isn't necessarily like God is not wrath in his being, but wrath is an expression of God's justice, who he is in his being. God is just.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. Something that, I think Sinclair Ferguson brought that up as well. That's an interesting idea. It's a manifestation of the attribute. Yeah.
Rather than being the attribute itself.
Right.
And so
I was trying to figure out that's maybe true with holiness.
How it's connected to holiness.
Yeah. So that's kind of where.
I think maybe that is how it is. Like if in verse 16 in chapter 5 it says he shows himself holy in righteousness, is like the righteousness is an outworking of his holiness. Like the holiness is the attribute and the righteousness is like the demonstration of that. In the same way that the justice is the attribute and the wrath is an outworking of the justice. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe.
Yeah. It's hard. Like I was just like even thinking like it says like this, like Isaiah 6 like uses the word holy, uses it 3 times, but doesn't give like a dictionary definition of what this means.
Yeah. I read that in Isaiah, the word holy is used more just in the book of Isaiah than in the entire Old Testament combined.
I believe it.
Like holiness is a central theme.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely worth some thought. Like, what is going on there?
And I think that's like, just like remembering that God is holy is like so key to us understanding who God is and then who we are in relation to him.
Yeah.
And so that's like my hope is like, at least in those first 7 verses, especially driving home, man, like I think R.C. Sproul said it, that our biggest problem is that God is holy and that we are not. You know, there's a lot of other things that we think are our biggest problem, right? Economics, politics, global warming, you know, whatever it might be. But that's
Yeah.
not that those things are unimportant, but that there's a deeper problem, and it's that God is holy and we're not.
Yes. There is a chasm. I mean, like Isaiah sees a chasm here.
Yeah.
I mean, he recognizes he's holy and I'm not. And so there's a problem. Like there's, but, and God enters into that and he fixes the problem. He introduces the solution to the problem that God must cleanse his people. And I think that maybe is like a picture of just the way that God's going to operate in the future, in that it requires repentance, like a humility to recognize your sin, a repentance, and then God entering into that with his cleansing, with Jesus cleansing blood, the suffering servant that we're going to get to later in the book of Isaiah.
Yeah. This is definitely, one of those like it is a gospel text. Not pre-gospel, it is a gospel text, but like this, developing this idea of atonement and God being the one that's going to have to provide this. It doesn't come from us.
So that I have a question on the altar that the coal is taken from by the seraphim. What is that? Like, is the altar symbolic for like the sacrifice that atones for sin? And like, maybe is that Jesus? Is that like an application of the work of Christ being transferred to Isaiah?
I don't know.
Yeah.
As you said that, I looked at my notes for verse 6. I have altar ?
Altar,
which I haven't read, which means I want to come back and answer that. So I'm not sure yet. Yeah, because I'm wondering that same thing. What does that mean? What does that symbolize? And kind of, I like the implication that you're drawing there. I like that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's because it doesn't specify what altar it is. Like there's multiple altars in the temple. Like you don't know if it's the altar of incense or if it's the bronze altar that like the sacrifices were being made on. So it's kind of, but maybe the fact that it's not specified is like, it's supposed to be ambiguous.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Who do you think is so in verse 4, it says the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him. Is that, do you think, the voice of the seraphim who are calling to one another? Or God? Because God hasn't spoken yet in the account.
Yeah, I'm trying to I would feel strongly, I think, about saying that it's probably God. That seems to be consistent, right? Seeing the Lord, sitting in the temple. All of this has been about describing God. It seems to be, so I don't know if it's maybe just it's implied that God's speaking while he's ruling, and Isaiah just doesn't record all of that at this point. Because, obviously he speaks here it starts in verse 8 and then through the end. At this point, my thought is that he's probably speaking in some capacity. Isaiah's just not writing down what he's saying.
Okay.
It seems to be like the point is not so much what he's saying right now, but like his word, he's speaking and things are shaking. Yeah. Like there's some power and awesomeness to this God who is now speaking.
Okay. That might be. I think that's how I always took it. I originally took it. But then to me, it just doesn't seem to fit. It seemed like at the voice of him who called, who had just called, like in verse 3, it says, and one called to another. And then it says in verse 4, at the voice of him who called, the foundations of the threshold shook, smoke filled. So I was wondering if it was like a response of the glory of God. Like maybe similar to, is it Uriah that like tries to reach out and touch the covenant? The Ark of Covenant.
Yeah, Uzziah or Uzzah or something like that.
Uzzah, maybe. Yeah. One of those U names.
Yeah.
And there's like a response, like the holiness of God. Like, is it to say he's consumed, or with fire or something? I can't remember what it is.
You talking about Uzzah with the ark?
Yeah.
I think he just is struck dead right there. Dead. Like he touches the ark and is dead right on the spot.
Okay.
I was trying to think. There's a consuming, like Nadab and
Abihu?
Yes, from Leviticus 10, they offer like the unholy offering, and then the fire consumes them. Is that what you're maybe
maybe
thinking
that's
of?
more what I was thinking. Yeah, but like an outworking or like God's holiness reacting with the physical world.
As in, like the seraphims are the ones that are
Like they're
speaking
ascribing glory and honor, and like God's glory has like a reaction. Like God is responding
to their
praise,
worship,
to their
yeah.
worship, and like in a way that interacts with creation. Like the ground shakes at the praise, like God's response to the praise, maybe of the seraphim.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, that's interesting.
And like smoke fills the house. Like
yeah,
that's all
interesting.
happening together.
Yeah, definitely gonna want to think about that some more.
Yeah.
But I like that thought. Any thoughts on 8 through 13 or anything like that, or anything else from 1 through 7?
I don't know. Definitely have more thoughts on 8 through 13. That probably does it for... It doesn't do it for 1 through 7, but it maybe could do it for today.
That's where we're at.
Yeah. 9, keep on hearing but do not understand. Keep on seeing but do not perceive. So that is the message that God gives to Isaiah, because the rest of it's just an explanation of what's going to happen as a response to that message. But that's like the message that he's called to preach.
Mm-hmm.
Keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. What are your initial thoughts on what that means?
Yeah, I think I looked at my cross references. I think this section of Isaiah 6 is quoted in all 4 gospel accounts, and in Acts and in Romans 11. Yeah. So I think I just found that interesting that like this specific section of Isaiah 6 is brought up several times. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all bring it up to like the keep on hearing and don't understand, to describe as like Jesus says that's why he speaks in parables.
Yeah.
Is that there's secret things that are for some and not for others, apparently. And so he says, I speak in parables to fulfill what Isaiah said. And he quotes from verse 9 here.
Right.
So there's that. And then I think John 12 quotes verse 10 specifically to explain why the Jews had responded in unbelief towards Jesus. Like he talks about how he's performing signs in front of them, right? They've got a front row seat. Like they should know. They have the covenants. They have the Old Testament. So why didn't they understand? It's because God made their hearts heavy. He didn't open them to see it.
Yeah.
Anyways, and I know that gets into some dicey waters of election and things like that, and trying to think through that.
What do you think's going on there?
For Isaiah specifically, or?
Yeah, so I read this, like keep on hearing but do not understand, keep on seeing but do not perceive. And then he goes on to kind of explain that they're not going to understand, they're not going to see, they're not going to hear. And he kind of like uses this threefold. So, and then he kind of flips it upside down. So he says, make the heart of this people dull, their ears heavy, they're blind their eyes. And then he says, lest they see with their eyes, so he's going in backwards order now, hear with their ears, and then understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. So there's the threefold description of their lack of understanding. And it seems like their lack of understanding is a judgment from God. Similar to maybe like Romans 1, where it says God gave them over to their passions because they refused to acknowledge him as God. Or maybe like Pharaoh, whose heart was hardened against God and against doing what Moses was calling Pharaoh to do, to let God's people go so that they might serve him in the wilderness. Do you think it's that same idea?
I think so. Yeah, it seems that like at least at this point, like Isaiah's message is going to have a hardening effect rather than a liberating effect. And I think that makes sense, like to what you just said too. Like you look at chapters 1 through 5, what you have is people that don't want God, right? They want their own desires. You know, they're offering sacrifices and stuff, but it's very clear that their hearts are really far from God. They're living for their own pleasure. They're committing all kinds of injustices. They're taking advantage of the poor and things like that. Very clear that they don't want God and they don't want his way of living. And so it seems that like in some sense, like, yes, God's, hardening them with this message in the sense that they're just going to double down in their sin, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like and it doesn't seem like it's a group of people that like are primed for repentance. Like they're wanting to seek God again. It seems like they're very much like, no, we don't want that. We want to be like Assyria. We want to be like Babylon. We don't want God's way because his way doesn't give us riches, or at least they think that doesn't give them riches and wealth and power and protection and all those things.
Yeah. I've heard it interpreted like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was God, like the Hebrew word is strengthen. So God strengthened his desire to not let the people go. Like Pharaoh's desire was always to not let God's people go. And God, when he hardened Pharaoh's heart, was basically giving Pharaoh over to do exactly what Pharaoh wanted to do. And it sounds like similar to what you were just saying. Like the people don't want God.
Yeah.
They don't want to repent. They don't want restoration. And God is essentially giving them over, or like ensuring that they get exactly what they do want.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what it is?
That's what I think so. Because I think we could maybe read, especially the back half of verse 10, like he's doing these things so that they wouldn't be healed. They wouldn't be able to see. We could maybe read that and think, oh man, these people want to turn to God, but God's not letting them. I think it's clear from chapters 1 through 5, they don't want God. Right. If we think about Israel's history up until this point, like all these prophets had come before them, God had worked through was supposed to work through the kings and stuff like that. Like it's very clear that the people don't want God's ways. They want their own way, and because they need a new heart, right? That's kind of like one of the themes of the Old Testament is they don't have the heart that can follow God yet, which we get to enjoy now. Like the new covenant that's promised in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, for example, doesn't come until the new covenant.
Right.
And so anyway, so to me, it seems like not keeping people from getting something that they do want, but like you said, continuing to let them pursue what they do want, even if that leads to their own destruction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which
all who come to me, I will not turn away.
Yep, exactly.
And it seems like on the surface that would be contradictory.
Yeah.
Like God saying like, lest they understand with their hearts and turn and be healed, is like, okay, but there's this truth in God's word that says all who come to me will find me. And like all who seek me, I will not turn away. And so that makes sense of how those are not contradictory. Like if any of them did, and we know that there were some.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So what do you think about, I mean, I guess this is more
like verse 13.
Verse 13, the holy seed is its stump. Who do you think the holy seed is? What do you think that is first?
Yeah, I need to study it more for sure.
Yeah.
It could either be like a remnant of true Israelites, right? True worshipers of Yahweh who have believed the gospel in that sense, have trusted in the promises of God for salvation. So it could be that like through the exile, he's waning off all these fake believers, if you will, and leaving what's pure left over.
Yeah.
So it could be that. It could be a reference to Jesus as the Messiah. Even the ESV has a helpful footnote that seed often can mean offspring. And so I'd want to think through, like in context, which of those actually makes sense there.
Yeah.
So I haven't studied enough to know, but I find that the last little line there really interesting.
Yeah.
Have you thought about it?
I haven't figured it out yet either. Those were my two thoughts. Like, is this a remnant that God's going to regrow his people from? Like we see that kind of that pattern throughout the Old Testament, or is it the ESV study note, like, or the cross reference made me think like, okay, is this maybe the offspring mentioned in Genesis?
Yeah.
Like, is it a perpetuation of that theme of an offspring is coming, a seed is coming, that is going to restore, that's going to regrow, that's going to crush the head of the serpent? I'm not quite sure yet, though.
And that may connect like with the like Romans chapter 9, where he talks about it's not as though the word of God has failed. And he goes on to explain that there's always been a line of the promise that God has always chosen throughout all of Israel's history. So that like that line, which starts with the seed of the woman in Genesis 3, finds its fulfillment obviously in Jesus. And so maybe connecting that imagery together, and the New Testament then carries that a little further to explain God's faithfulness in this whole time. Because I think either way, it shows like God's faithful to. In the other prophets, it says often that he's not bringing them to a complete end.
Right.
Right. There's still his goal is not to wipe them out, but to make, like what you said, to purify them, to make them holy as he is holy.
Yeah. And it's death is never. I read this. Death is never the final say, or like it's never the final. There is always life promised. Like there's always a hope of restoration ultimately.
Yeah.
And not for every single individual, but in a general ultimate sense, God always works toward life, even if in the midst of that there is some death, there is some suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a tricky I'm not sure exactly how to preach that section yet. One, I want to make sure I understand it rightly.
Right.
But then, I'm not sure what the application to draw is. Because I don't think the application is, I'm going to go share the gospel with someone. If they say no, it's because God doesn't let you understand. And so, peace out. You're toast,
Right.
Like that would be I think that's the wrong application to draw from it. But it honestly makes me think of, I think it's Isaiah 55:10, like the word of the Lord doesn't return void, but it accomplishes exactly what it's purposed for.
Right.
I think we typically think that means, if I do something, then it's going to work out favorably. But to me, it seems like there's also like sometimes the gospel hardens people in their sin. They come into contact with a holy God. They say, I would rather have my sin. And so his word is accomplishing exactly that. It's giving them over to their sin, even though they're running into a chance to turn and repent. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's true.
Yeah. It sounds all good to me. Like it seems to line up. It's just a hard thing.
Yeah.
Hard truth.
For sure.
These ones are difficult.
Yeah.
Especially in the preaching. Like it's one thing to understand something on a conceptual level, on a theological level, but it's another to communicate what you believe is true in a way that is uncompromising yet gracious.
Yeah. Sensitive.
And charitable and sensitive and kind.
Yeah.
That's a challenge.
Yeah. Because there's a way to be really rude with this truth.
Yeah.
And be unhelpful. Maybe say something that's true, but communicate it, apply it in a way that's maybe even not true, but at the very least unhelpful.
Right.
And so I have to be really careful. Yeah, we have to be really careful with that.
Yeah.
And so, I want to be thinking through what that is. It seems like at some level, like part of our commission to ministry is that we're going to preach to people that are just going to respond negatively.
Yeah. We're a fragrance of death.
Yeah. Yep.
To some, and we're a fragrance of life to others.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is.
Yep. Yeah. I think that gives comfort to believers as, because we'll have people we share the gospel with and be frustrated at times. Like, man, why can't this person just get it? And a lot of times we think, well, it's probably because I'm messing up or I'm a lousy evangelist or whatever. Not saying that we all can't grow, but it may just well be that you're doing exactly what God's called you to do. And you just got to keep going and pursue faithfulness and trust that God will take care of the results in whatever way he chooses to turn that out.
Yeah. That's really hard.
But that's hard. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Let's see. He says, "How long, O Lord?"
Yeah.
And then God gives this answer. What's the answer? Is this like after the Babylonian exile? Is that what you think primarily this is? Is this talking about something maybe even farther in the future?
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure exactly what it was referring to.
I've got exactly those questions in red.
Yeah.
Yeah, trying to figure out, at the very least, I think there's an implication that it's at least partially fulfilled after the exile. But I think it'll depend on how I understand that holy seed reference. Because even after the exile, things don't just magically get better.
Right.
They basically, they have a little bit of even in like Ezra and Nehemiah, like things are sort of good, but also sort of not good. Yeah. And so it's clear that like the national exile wasn't the solution to their sin. Right. But it did foreshadow something that was to come. That there was going to be someone that was going to basically take on that exile for them in Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so trying to figure out if this has a near fulfillment in the exile, but because of the way everything goes after the exile, it's clear that it's not fully fulfilled until Christ or in the future. I'm not sure yet. Yeah.
What about the burning again?
Yeah.
Though a tenth remain in it, it'll be burned again. I think this one confuses me even more. Yeah. Because if the first burning or the first purification is the exile, right, then how do we understand the second burning? Yeah. And
I have that exact. I have what's left over burned again? Question mark.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how to speculate on that
I don't know
at this
either.
point.
It's like I at first it seems like a reference to the idea of when you cut down a tree, you burn the stump to basically like kill the tree. But then you have the holy seed as its stump, which we know like continues on the idea there. It seems like the idea is there that's going to regrow into something bigger, better, more beautiful. So that doesn't really go with it.
Yeah,
But I don't know why you would burn a stump a second time.
yeah.
I don't know.
And it seems like the ESV has a good footnote. This word can be translated either burned or purged. And so there seems to be like this idea of like kind of we've been talking about a purification or a cleansing. But yeah, like why does that happen a second time? What is that? Is that a national moment? Is that a spiritual reality?
Right.
I don't know.
That's a hard one.
That's that one. Yeah, I think that's probably my biggest question from this section too. That and the Holy Seed. Yeah.
Yeah, I have like a string of like 5 questions on just verse 13.
Yeah.
Like, what is the second burning? Is the stump receiving the second burning? Like, is the holy seed Jesus? Are the preserved faithful remnant? There's just so many questions about that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I here's a thought I had. A stump will regrow, right, after it's been cut down, and maybe the stump is Christ and he's burned, he's killed, and seems to be defeated, but then rises and grows back up a people for God. Like it seems like the tree is defeated, like it's been cut down, it's been burned, but then it actually like rises from the dead, like it comes back up. I don't know. That one was a little far-fetched, I think, but
No, yeah, I'm trying to think through like in terms of like if there's a sense where the exile cleanses in a sense, but it's not enough. Obviously, again, it doesn't clean them from their sin,
right.
And so there's going to have to be a second cleansing. That's a spiritual cleansing, which comes when Jesus dies and rises again.
Gotcha.
And then that creates, but
Okay.
like that would be maybe supported if that holy seed is a reference to Jesus. Like I said, I wouldn't preach that right now, at least.
What do you think the connection is? Do you think there's any connection between the burning coal and this burning purification? Do you think there's any connection there?
Like if the
Like Isaiah is cleansed by this burning coal, and if it seems like maybe this is the case, that Isaiah is like a microcosm of the nation of Israel, and so Isaiah is like receiving this burning coal that's purifying him, and then we read the nation is going to be burnt, is going to be cut down, is going to be destroyed, and a holy seed is going to come up out of that. Do you think that the coal is supposed to represent the judgment of God on the people, like the cleansing, the burning, the purging?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It might not be there, but
I think at the very least, like in chapter 4, Isaiah looks forward to this day when the branch is glorified, and it says that, let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, this is in verse 4, when the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from the midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. And that same word, it looks like it can also be translated purging, which probably I'd be curious to see if it's a similar word here with this in verse 13. But to me, at the very least, it seems like this burning is just this metaphor. This communicates this reality to be cleaned from sin, purged from wickedness, so that righteousness can be what remains.
yeah, and Israel receives an image of that or a picture of that in the exile. But they're, like you said, they come back to the land, but they still have the problem of the holiness of God and their uncleanness.
Yeah.
And so we need a second final purging.
Yeah.
We need someone to take the judgment for us. Like
Yeah.
in an ultimate sense.
Right.
Like the ultimate judgment is the wrath of God, like the final death-bringing wrath of God that utterly destroys. And the only one that could actually endure that was God himself. And so he takes his own wrath in place of his people so that once and for all, they actually can be made holy.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I'm not sure if that's the idea here, but I like that idea.
I like it.
And
Yeah.
I think that idea is true. You're just trying to figure out, that's here,
Right.
but in Isaiah 6. And that's kind of like the flood too. Like God sees mankind, it's wicked, it's greatly evil. The flood takes out everyone except for Noah and his family and everything. And it's clear. I think in Genesis 8 it talks about yet even still like the intentions of man are only evil from his youth.
Right.
And so
it's right after they get off the boat, and then he looks at the land and he says, like, there is no one on the earth, like all the people of the earth are still like wicked at their core. And like Noah's and his family are the only ones on the earth at that point.
Yeah.
So
it's like even after the flood, God still looks out and says, hey, man is a sin problem.
Yeah.
So it's like clear that the solution to our sin problem, the solution to get back to a new Eden, if you will, is not going to be through a change of scenery, a change of environment. Here for Israel, it wasn't like an exile, a physical exile wasn't going to bring them the righteousness that they needed. They were going to need
it requires a full transformation.
Yeah.
Like a complete change of being, like a complete change of person.
Yeah.
A new creation.
A new creation, exactly. They need new hearts, as Ezekiel and Jeremiah talk about. I think that's even predicted in Deuteronomy 30-something. Looking forward to there's going to be a day where God circumcises the hearts of his people.
Yeah.
Romans 2 makes it clear that circumcision happens by the Spirit, not by the law.
Right. Yeah. And Christ is the image, is the one that we're being conformed to.
Right.
And that's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good stuff.
That was great. I think I didn't get all my questions answered. I don't know how many I got answered even, but it was helpful.
Me neither.
It was helpful for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate, just your thoughtfulness on this. Thanks for helping me sharpen some of my own ideas too. But also just appreciate your thoughtful questions. So thanks for asking those.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks everybody for listening. And until next time, may each of us be making much of Christ by reaching and equipping the people in our lives for his glory.